The sun had no mercy that afternoon. It beat down on Hollow Ridge like a hammer on an anvil, turning the dusty main street into a furnace that shimmered and wavered in the heat. The town looked half dead, maybe more than half. Paint peeled from storefronts that hadn't seen customers in weeks. A saloon door hung crooked on broken hinges. The general store's windows were so grimy you couldn't see inside anymore, and maybe that was intentional. When a place starts dying, folks stop caring what it looks like. Ethan Cole didn't care much about appearances either. He sat slumped on a wooden bench outside the defunct telegraph office, hat pulled low over his face, arms crossed loose over his chest. To anyone passing by, he looked like just another drifter catching some shade before moving on. His clothes were trail-worn, dusty denim, a shirt that had seen better days, boots with heels run down on one side from years in stirrups. Nothing about him screamed dangerous. Nothing about him screamed anything at all, really. That was intentional, too. 10 feet away, his horse stood in what passed for shade beneath a half-dead cottonwood tree. Ghost, that's what Ethan called him, though he'd never been much for naming things, was a gray gelding with intelligent eyes and a patience that bordered on supernatural. The horse didn't doze like his rider. He stood alert, ears swiveling, tracking sounds and movement with the focus of a sentry. If you knew horses, you'd recognize that Ghost wasn't just waiting. He was watching. Ethan's breathing was slow and even. His chest rose and fell in the rhythm of genuine sleep, not the fake kind men use when they're pretending. He'd learned years ago that real rest came harder the more you needed it. So when the opportunity presented itself, you took it. Didn't matter if the bench was hard or the heat oppressive. Didn't matter if you were in the middle of nowhere or the middle of somewhere. Sleep when you can, because you never know when you'll get another chance. He didn't know that 3 men were riding into town with his name in their pockets and murder in their plans. Didn't know that Victor Langford, the land magnate whose operation he'd torn apart in Ashford Crossing 6 months back, had put $500 on his head. Didn't know that this nameless, forgotten little rail town was about to become the most important place he'd ever closed his eyes. Sometimes ignorance is the only peace a man gets. Ush! Silas Ward saw the horse first. He reined in his bay at the edge of town, raising one gloved hand to signal the other 2 riders behind him. They stopped without question, Brock because he knew better than to second-guess Silas, and Jet because he was too green to know when to think for himself. "There," Silas said quietly, nodding toward the cottonwood. Brock Vance leaned forward in his saddle, squinting against the glare. He was built like a barn, all shoulders and no neck, with hands that could crush a man's windpipe without much effort. He wasn't smart, but he didn't need to be. Silas did the thinking. Brock did the heavy work. That's how it had worked for 3 years, and it worked well enough that they were still alive. "Gray horse," Brock confirmed. "Could be anybody's." "Could be," Silas agreed. His eyes, pale blue and unsettling in their stillness, never left the animal. "But it's not." Jet Corbin, barely 22 and eager to prove he belonged, edged his roan forward. "How do you know?" Silas didn't answer right away. He studied the scene with the methodical patience of a man who'd tracked dozens of bounties and lived to collect on most of them. The horse's stance, the way it faced the street instead of the wall, the lack of a tether, yet no indication it planned to wander. These weren't details you explained to someone like Jet. Either you saw them or you didn't. "Bartender in Red Bluff said Cole rides a gray," Silas finally said. "Said the horse watches people like it knows something they don't." Jet stared at Ghost for a moment, then shrugged. "Lot of gray horses in the territory." "Lot of stupid comments, too," Brock muttered. "But we still gotta listen to 'em." Jet's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. He'd learned in the past 2 weeks that arguing with Brock was like arguing with a rock slide, pointless and likely to get you hurt. Silas swung down from his saddle, movements economical and precise. He was lean in the way of men who'd spent more time hungry than full, with a face that looked older than his 38 years. Everything about him was controlled. His voice, his posture, even the way he breathed. It was the control of a man who'd learned that staying calm kept you alive longer than being fast. "We walk from here," he said. "Spread out. Jet, you take the left side of the street. Brock, stay with me." "What about the horse?" Jet asked. "What about it?" "Might spook. Might warn him." Silas looked at Jet like he'd just suggested they fly into town. You think a man smart enough to dismantle Victor Langford's entire operation is going to wake up because a horse shifts its weight? Jet opened his mouth, then closed it. That's what I thought, Silas said. Now move. They entered Hollow Ridge on foot, 3 men with purpose cutting through the drowsy stillness of a dying afternoon. Silas kept his hand near his revolver, but not on it. No need to broadcast intent when surprise was your advantage. Brock walked with the rolling gait of a man whose size made subtlety impossible, but he was quieter than you'd expect. Jet tried to mimic their confidence and mostly succeeded, though his right hand kept drifting toward his gun like he was checking to make sure it hadn't vanished. The street was empty. Not unusual for this time of day in a place like Hollow Ridge. Folks with sense stayed inside when the heat got biblical. A dog slept in the shade of the saloon. A tattered cloth sign squeaked as it swung from a rusted chain. Somewhere distant, a shutter banged lazily against a wall. And there, on the bench outside the telegraph office, a man slept like he didn't have a care in the world. Silas felt that familiar tightness in his chest, the one that came right before a job got finished. It wasn't excitement, exactly, more like certainty, the feeling of pieces falling into place. That's him, he said softly. Brock grunted. How do you know? Can't even see his face. Look at his boots. Brock looked. So did Jet. The boots were worn down on the outside of the left heel, a telltale pattern that came from years of mounting and dismounting from the same side. The bartender in Red Bluff had mentioned it. Small detail, easy to miss, but Silas didn't miss details. Details kept you alive. Details put money in your pocket. Could still be somebody else, Jet whispered. Silas didn't bother responding. He drew his revolver, smooth, practiced, silent, and started forward. Mara Ellison was measuring flour when she saw them through her kitchen window. 3 men, walking with intent, guns visible. They moved like hunters, not travelers. She'd seen enough of both in her 46 years to know the difference. Travelers looked around, took in the town, showed curiosity or wariness, or both. Hunters looked at one thing and nothing else. She set down the measuring cup and wiped her hands on her apron. Her boarding house sat on the corner where the main street intersected with what used to be called Commerce Avenue before Commerce dried up and blew away. From her kitchen, she had a view of most of the town's dying heart. She'd watched Hollow Ridge shrink year by year, families leaving, businesses closing, hope evaporating like water on hot stone. She'd stayed because leaving required money she didn't have and energy she'd lost somewhere along the way, but she hadn't lost her eyes. She recognized the man on the bench. He'd ridden in yesterday evening, paid for a room, ate a quiet supper, and asked where he could stable his horse. Polite, soft-spoken, gave his name as Cole, and didn't offer more. She hadn't pushed. People came to Hollow Ridge for 2 reasons. They were lost or they were hiding. Either way, their business was their own. Now 3 armed men were walking straight toward him, and he was sound asleep. Mara grabbed her shawl off the hook by the door. Where are you going? Her daughter Sarah looked up from the table where she was peeling potatoes. Out! Mama? Stay here. Sarah started to protest, saw the look on her mother's face, and went quiet. Mara had that effect when she needed to. 20 years of running a boarding house alone after her husband died had filed her down to pure practicality. She didn't waste words, she didn't waste time, and she sure as hell didn't waste energy on fear. She stepped out into the heat and started walking. Silas was 15 feet from the bench when he saw movement in his peripheral vision. A woman coming from the left. Middle-aged, plain dress, shawl despite the heat. She walked with the determined stride of someone who had business to conduct, but her trajectory was all wrong. She wasn't heading to the store or the saloon or anywhere that made sense. She was heading straight for him. He slowed but didn't stop. Brock, reading the shift in Silas's posture, angled slightly to intercept. Jet froze, uncertain. The woman didn't slow down at all. Silas raised his free hand, a gesture that was half greeting, half warning. Ma'am, this doesn't concern you. Mara Ellison looked him dead in the eye and kept walking. Ma'am, Silas said again, sharper this time. Step aside. She reached the space between Silas and the sleeping man on the bench and stopped. Planted her feet. Crossed her arms. She wasn't tall, maybe 5'4", but the way she stood made her seem bigger. Immovable. No, she said. Silas blinked. In 15 years of bounty hunting, he'd been shot at, stabbed, ambushed, and once thrown off a moving train. But he'd never had someone just say no and mean it like that. This man's wanted, Silas said, keeping his voice level. We're here to collect. Now, unless you want trouble, you'll... I said no. Brock shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable. He wasn't used to complications that couldn't be solved with intimidation or violence. Women, especially older women, fell outside his operational framework. Jet, on the other hand, took a step forward. Lady, you don't understand. I understand just fine, Mara cut him off. Her voice had the flat, unimpressed tone of a schoolteacher addressing a particularly dim student. 3 men with guns, 1 man asleep. Math's pretty simple. Then you understand why you should move, Silas said. Didn't say I was gonna. Silas felt the job slipping. He'd had bounties go sideways before. Targets who fought back, lawmen who showed up at bad times, deals that fell through. But this was something else. This was an unarmed woman refusing to step aside, and he couldn't shoot her. Couldn't. You start killing random women in the middle of the street, and suddenly every town becomes hostile territory. Suddenly other bounty hunters start looking at you different. Suddenly sheriffs stop looking the other way. Ma'am, he said, trying one more time. $500 says we're taking this man one way or another. All you're doing is making it harder on yourself. Mara's expression didn't change. Then I guess it's going to be hard. A door creaked open across the street. Silas's eyes flicked toward the sound. An older man stepped out of the general store. Gray beard, bib overalls, suspicious squint. He looked at the scene unfolding in the street, looked at Mara standing her ground, and something passed across his face. Not quite decision, more like recognition. He stepped off the boardwalk and started walking toward them. The hell? Jet muttered. Silas felt that tightness in his chest again, but this time it wasn't certainty. This time it felt like the moment before a rock slide when you hear the first pebbles starting to fall. Another door opened. A woman this time, younger, carrying a broom. She looked scared. Silas could see it in her face, but she came anyway. Walked right up next to the old man and stopped, creating a second point in what was starting to look like a line. Then a third person. Then a fourth. They came out of houses and shops like ghosts materializing in daylight. A blacksmith with hammer in hand, a thin woman in a faded dress. 2 teenage boys who should have known better. A man using a crutch, limping but determined. They didn't say anything. Didn't make threats or demands. They just came and stood, forming a human barrier between the bounty hunters and the sleeping man on the bench. Within 2 minutes, there were 12 people in the street. Within 5, there were 20. Silas had never seen anything like it. Brock's hand moved to his gun. Boss, don't, Silas said quietly. They're just... I said don't. Jet looked like he wanted to say something but couldn't figure out what. His eyes darted from face to face, trying to understand what was happening and failing completely. Silas understood perfectly. He just didn't like it. This wasn't heroism. Wasn't nobility. These people weren't defending Ethan Cole because they knew him or owed him or even liked him. They were defending him because Mara Ellison had decided to. And in a town like Hollow Ridge, a place small enough that everyone knew everyone, a place where survival meant trusting your neighbors because there wasn't anybody else. When one person took a stand, others followed. Not out of courage, out of habit. We can go through them, Jet said, trying to sound confident. No, Silas said. We can't. Why not? Because you don't shoot 20 unarmed people in the middle of the street and ride away clean. Because every lawman in 3 territories would be hunting us by sundown. Because the 3 of us would be worth more dead than Cole is alive. Silas holstered his revolver, slow and deliberate. And because $500 isn't worth dying over. So what do we do? Brock asked. Silas looked at the crowd, at Mara Ellison standing front and center with her arms still crossed, at the sleeping man who had no idea what was happening around him. We wait, Silas said. One. Ethan woke to the feeling of weight in the air. Not sound, though there was sound, the murmur of multiple voices held low. Not movement, though people were definitely moving, shifting, breathing. It was something more instinctive than that, the feeling you get when you're being watched by more than one pair of eyes. The feeling that tells you something's changed while you weren't paying attention. He didn't jerk awake, didn't reach for a weapon he wasn't wearing. He just opened his eyes under the brim of his hat and took stock. Feet. Lots of them. A semicircle of people standing between him and three men he didn't recognize, but whose intent was written all over their postures. Armed, professional, patient, bounty hunters. Ethan sat up slowly, pushing his hat back. He ran a hand through his hair, dark, getting long, shot through with more gray than he cared to acknowledge, and looked at the crowd that had apparently formed while he slept. "Morning," he said. His voice was rough from sleep and dust. A few people glanced back at him. Most kept their eyes on the three armed men. Mara Ellison didn't look at him at all. "Little past morning," she said, "but close enough." Ethan stood, joints protesting slightly. He was 39 but felt 50 some days. This was one of those days. He took in the scene with the practiced assessment of someone who'd been in more bad situations than good ones. 3 hunters, 2 experienced, 1 green. A crowd of civilians with no weapons and no training. A standoff nobody could win. "Y'all should probably step aside," Ethan said to the crowd. "No," Mara said simply. "Ma'am, I said no." We all heard it the first time. Ethan looked at her, really looked, saw the set of her jaw, the way her hands gripped her elbows, the fine tremor she was trying to hide. She was terrified. They all were. But they were here anyway. "I appreciate what you're doing," Ethan said carefully. "But these men are here for me. No reason for anybody else to get hurt." "That's what they said too." Mara jerked her chin toward Silas. "Didn't change my mind then either." Silas took a step forward. "Cole, that is you, right?" Ethan nodded once. "Victor Langford put a bounty on you. 500. We're here to collect." 500, Ethan repeated. "That all I'm worth?" "Depends on whether you come quiet or loud." Ethan almost smiled. Almost. "Usually comes out loud one way or another." "Doesn't have to." "Never does." Somehow always ends up that way, though. They stood there in the heat, 2 professionals weighing each other. Silas saw a man who looked tired but not scared, worn but not weak. Ethan saw a man who was good at his job and knew it, which made him more dangerous than someone reckless. "Tell you what," Ethan said. "Give me 5 minutes. I'll get my horse and ride out with you. Nobody here needs to be involved." "No," Mara said again. Ethan turned to her. "Ma'am, with respect." "No respect required," she interrupted. "And no permission either. You don't speak for this town, Mr. Cole. You're just passing through. We live here." Which is exactly why we get to decide what kind of place this is. Her voice rose slightly, not quite a shout, but close. We get to decide if we're the kind of town that looks away when 3 armed men come for 1 sleeping man. We get to decide if we're the kind of people who let that happen in our street. Silence fell heavy and thick. One of the teenage boys, a skinny kid with a sunburned neck, spoke up. "She's right." Another voice from the crowd. "Damn right she's right." The old man with the gray beard nodded slowly. "Been looking away for too long. Maybe that's why everything's fallen apart." Ethan felt something shift in his chest. It wasn't quite emotion. He'd trained himself out of that mostly. But it was close. These people didn't know him, didn't owe him. Hell, half of them probably didn't even like strangers. But they'd drawn a line in their dying town, and they weren't moving. He turned back to Silas. "Looks like I'm not going anywhere." Silas's jaw tightened. "Those folks can't stand there forever." "Maybe not. But they're standing there now. We can wait." "So can I." Brock made a frustrated sound. "This is ridiculous." "Yeah," Ethan agreed. "It is." Jet's hand drifted toward his gun again. You should just shut up," Silas snapped. He kept his eyes on Ethan. "There's 3 of us, and 1 of you." "And about 30 of them," Ethan pointed out. "Math still doesn't work in your favor. They're civilians. So? So they'll break. They'll get tired or scared or smart, and they'll go home." "Maybe," Ethan said. "Or maybe you'll get tired of waiting and make a mistake. Maybe that kid you brought will do something stupid. Maybe a lawman will ride through and ask questions you don't want to answer." He shrugged. "A lot of maybes in a situation like this." Silas studied him for a long moment. "You're awful calm for a man with a price on his head." "Been calm before. Hasn't killed me yet. There's a first time for everything. There is, Ethan agreed, but I don't think today's that day. Silas looked at the crowd again, looked at Mara Ellison standing like a granite monument, looked at his two partners, one too violent and one too green, neither one suitable for the delicate situation this had become. He'd been in the business long enough to recognize a losing play. "We'll be around," he finally said. "I figured. $500 doesn't just disappear." "No," Ethan said. "It doesn't." Silas backed away slowly, gesturing for Brock and Jet to follow. They retreated down the street, not quite defeated, but definitely stalled. When they reached their horses, Silas turned back one more time. "Question, Cole." "Yeah?" "Was it worth it? Whatever you did to Langford?" Ethan thought about Ashford Crossing, about the families Langford had displaced, the people he'd cheated, the violence he'd used to build his little empire. Ethan had dismantled it piece by piece, exposed the fraud, confronted the enforcers, burned the contracts that had no legal standing. It had taken 3 months and nearly gotten him killed twice. "Yeah," Ethan said, "it was." Silas nodded slowly, like he'd expected that answer. Then he mounted up, and the 3 hunters rode out of town, heading south. The crowd held position for another minute, making sure the threat was really gone. Then, one by one, they started to disperse. No cheering, no celebration, just a quiet return to whatever they'd been doing before. Because that's what you did in a place like Hollow Ridge. You dealt with what came, and then you went back to surviving. Mara lingered. Ethan walked over to her, stopped at a respectful distance. "Thank you." She waved it off. "Don't thank me." "Why'd you do it?" She looked at him, really looked, the way she'd looked at Silas earlier. "I heard stories about what happened in Ashford Crossing, about a man who stood up to Victor Langford when everybody else was too scared or too bought. Stories aren't always accurate. Accurate enough." She paused, choosing her words. "This town's been dying for years. People stopped caring, stopped trying, stopped standing up for anything. We just let it happen." She gestured vaguely at the empty street. "Maybe I was tired of that. Maybe I figured if someone was going to get killed in front of my boarding house, least I could do was make sure it wasn't easy. Could have gotten yourself hurt." "Could have," she agreed. "Didn't, though." "They'll be back." "I know. Might not go as smooth next time." Mara smiled, thin, hard, real. "Nothing ever does." She turned and walked back toward her boarding house, shawl trailing in the dust. Ethan watched her go, then looked around at Hollow Ridge, the faded buildings, the empty street, the whole dying enterprise of it. Ghost nickered softly from under the cottonwood tree. "Yeah," Ethan said quietly. "I know, we should go." But he didn't move. Not yet. Because something had happened here that didn't happen often. Something rare and strange and worth paying attention to. A town that should have looked away had chosen not to. People who had no reason to care had cared anyway. And Ethan Cole, who'd spent most of his adult life riding away from places and people, found himself wondering what it would be like to stay. Silas made camp 3 miles south of Hollow Ridge, far enough to be out of sight, but close enough to keep watch. They built a small fire as the sun started its descent, cooking beans and salt pork in silence. Jet broke first. "So what now?" "Now we wait," Silas said. "For what?" "For those people to go back to their lives. For Cole to let his guard down. For an opportunity." Brock poked at the fire with a stick. "Could take days. Could take weeks." $500, Jet muttered. "And we're sitting in the dirt eating beans." Silas looked at him across the flames. "You got somewhere better to be?" Jet didn't answer. "Didn't think so." Silas pulled a telegram from his pocket, the one that had started this whole job. He'd read it so many times he had it memorized, but he read it again anyway. Ethan Cole, wanted for interference and destruction of property. $500 reward. Victor Langford, Ashford Crossing. Simple. Straightforward. $500 for a man who'd made himself inconvenient to someone rich. Except Silas was starting to suspect it wasn't that simple. A man who dismantles a land magnate's operation doesn't do it by accident, doesn't do it halfway. And he definitely doesn't do it if he's just some drifter looking for trouble. You do something like that because you have a reason, a purpose, which meant Ethan Cole was more than he appeared. which meant $500 might not be enough. Silas tucked the telegram back into his pocket and stared at the fire. Tomorrow he'd ride into the next town and send some inquiries. Find out more about Ashford Crossing. Find out what exactly Cole had done and why. Find out if the job was worth finishing. Because tonight, sitting in the dirt 3 miles from a town that had stood between him and his bounty, Silas Ward had the uncomfortable feeling that he'd picked the wrong target. Back in Hollow Ridge, Ethan sat on the boarding house porch as twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and orange. Mara brought him a plate of stew and cornbread, set it down without comment, and sat in the chair next to him. They ate in comfortable silence for a while. "How long you planning to stay?" Mara finally asked. Ethan chewed slowly, thinking. Was planning to leave tonight. Probably should leave tonight. But I'm tired. He said it simply, without elaboration. Tired covered a lot of ground. Tired of running. Tired of looking over his shoulder. Tired of places that existed only to pass through. Mara nodded like she understood. Maybe she did. "One night won't hurt," she said. "Room's already paid for. Those men will come back. Let them?" "You sound awfully confident for someone who was scared half to death this afternoon." She gave him a sharp look. "Being scared doesn't mean you stop. Just means you do it scared." Ethan smiled, a real one this time. "Fair enough." They finished eating as darkness settled over Hollow Ridge like a worn blanket. Somewhere down the street, someone played a fiddle badly. A dog barked. Normal sounds of a normal evening in a town that refused to finish dying. "Tell me about Ashford Crossing," Mara said. So Ethan did. Not everything. Some details were better left buried, but enough. He told her about Victor Langford's operation, how he'd used fraudulent contracts and hired muscle to force families off their land, how he'd built a network of corruption that stretched through 3 counties, how nobody had stopped him because stopping him meant standing up to money and power, and most people weren't willing to pay that price. "But you were," Mara said. "Wasn't planning to be. Just happened to be there when it started going bad. Happened to know the law well enough to see the cracks. Happened to be too stubborn to let it go once I saw what was happening. And now you've got a bounty on your head. And now I've got a bounty on my head," Ethan agreed. "Was it worth it?" She asked the same question Silas had asked. Ethan looked out at the dark street, at the town that had stood for him when it had no reason to. "Yeah," he said quietly. "It was." They sat there until the stars came out, 2 people who'd been worn down by the world finding brief company in the aftermath of something neither quite understood. Eventually Mara stood, collected the plates, and headed inside. "Mr. Cole?" she said from the doorway. "Yes, ma'am?" "Tomorrow morning, you should probably leave, before those men come back." "I know. But I'm glad you were here today." Ethan looked at her. "So am I." She nodded and went inside, leaving him alone on the porch with his thoughts and the sound of crickets singing in the darkness. Ghost stood in the small corral behind the boarding house, still alert, still watching. Ethan could see his silhouette against the starlight, patient, steady, ready. "Soon," Ethan said softly, though the horse was too far away to hear. "We'll leave soon. But not tonight. Tonight, Ethan Cole would sleep in a real bed in a town that had chosen to stand for something, and for the first time in months he'd sleep without the weight of constant movement pressing down on his chest. The bounty hunters would come back. The danger wasn't over. Morning would bring its own complications and decisions. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight, in Hollow Ridge, a man who'd forgotten how to stop finally allowed himself to rest, and the town that had held the line for him settled into its own uneasy peace, not knowing yet that they'd started something that couldn't be easily undone, something that would change them all before the next sun set. Morning came too early and too bright. Ethan woke to the sound of someone hammering nails into wood somewhere down the street, steady, rhythmic, insistent. He lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling of the small room, letting his mind catch up with his body. The bed had been softer than he was used to. His back didn't hurt as much as it usually did. Small mercies. He sat up slowly, swung his legs over the side of the bed, and reached for his boots. Through the window he could see Hollow Ridge beginning its day, what passed for a day in a place where most of the commerce had dried up years ago. A woman swept the boardwalk in front of the general store. Two men stood talking near the livery, life continuing in the stubborn way it does when there's nothing else to do but continue. Ethan dressed, checked his reflection in the small mirror above the wash basin, and decided he looked about as rough as he felt. The gray in his hair seemed more pronounced in the morning light. The lines around his eyes cut deeper. He was getting old for this kind of life. The running, the looking over shoulders, the sleeping in strange beds in strange towns. He splashed water on his face, ran wet fingers through his hair, and headed downstairs. The dining room was small, 4 tables, mismatched chairs, a sideboard with chipped paint. Mara stood at the stove in the adjacent kitchen, working on something that smelled like coffee and bacon. 2 other boarders sat at the far table. Older men, ranch hands maybe, eating in the focused silence of people who worked with their bodies. "Morning," Mara said without turning around. "Coffee's on the table? Breakfast in 5 minutes." Ethan poured himself a cup and sat near the window where he could see the street. The coffee was strong enough to strip paint and tasted like it had been made the night before and reheated. He drank it anyway. Mara brought over a plate, eggs, bacon, biscuits, and set it down with minimal ceremony. She lingered for a moment, wiping her hands on her apron. "Sleep all right?" "Better than I have in a while." "Good." She glanced toward the window. "Those men showed up about an hour ago. They're watching the livery." Ethan didn't turn to look. "Figured they would. You planning to just walk past them?" "Hadn't decided yet." Mara pulled out the chair across from him and sat down with her own cup of coffee. Her daughter Sarah emerged from the kitchen carrying a pot of fresh coffee, refilling cups with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been doing it her whole life. She was maybe 19, with her mother's sharp eyes and her father's build, tall, sturdy, capable. "Mama says those men are back," Sarah said quietly, topping off Ethan's cup. "That's what I hear." "What are you going to do?" "Sarah," Mara said, a warning in her voice. "What? I'm just asking." Ethan looked at the girl, young enough to still believe questions deserved answers, old enough to understand when things were complicated. "Honestly, I don't know yet." "You could stay," Sarah said. "We could—" "Sarah, go check on the laundry." "But now." Sarah shot her mother a frustrated look, but obeyed, disappearing back into the kitchen. Mara sighed and rubbed her temples. "She means well," Mara said. "Just doesn't understand how things work yet." "How do things work?" "You leave. Those men follow. Eventually, they catch up to you somewhere else, and whatever happens, happens away from here." She met his eyes. "That's how it's supposed to work." "Supposed to," Ethan agreed, "but rarely does." He ate his breakfast slowly, watching the street. The hammering continued, someone repairing a storefront maybe, or building something new. That struck him as optimistic for a dying town. Most places this far gone didn't bother with repairs. "Who's doing the construction?" he asked. Mara glanced out the window. "Thomas Brennan owns the general store. Been talking about fixing his awning for 2 years. Guess yesterday gave him some energy." "Yesterday," Ethan repeated. People standing up for something tends to do that. Makes folks remember they're not completely powerless. She paused. Or completely alone. Ethan absorbed that, turning it over in his mind. He'd seen it before. Small acts of resistance creating ripples, changing the way people saw themselves. But usually those acts came from inside the community, not from defending a stranger who'd be gone by sunrise. "I should have left last night," he said. "Probably." Makes things complicated, staying, usually does. They sat in companionable silence while Ethan finished his breakfast. The 2 ranch hands paid their bill and left, nodding at Mara on their way out. The sun climbed higher, promising another scorching day. "Mr. Cole," Mara said finally, "can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "What's the end game here? For you, I mean. You can't run forever." It was a fair question, one Ethan had asked himself more times than he cared to count. "Don't know that there is an end game, just the next town, the next day, the next time I have to decide whether to stay or go." "That's not a life." "No," Ethan agreed. "It's not." Mara started to say something else but stopped as the front door opened. The old man with the gray beard from yesterday stepped inside, breathing hard like he'd been hurrying. His name was George Hendricks. Ethan had learned that much at supper last night. "Mara," George said, "we got a problem." "What kind of problem?" "Those bounty hunters. They're not just watching anymore. They're asking questions. Told the Patterson boys that anyone who helps Cole is obstructing justice. Said there could be consequences. Mara's expression hardened. That a fact? Silas, the one who does all the talking, he's smart about it. Not making threats exactly, just suggestions. Reminders that $500 is a lot of money for information. Ethan stood up. Where are they now? Saloon, buying drinks, being friendly? George looked at him. You need to understand something, Mr. Cole. Most folks here don't have much. $500 is more than some families see in a year. They start offering that kind of money to anyone who helps them. I understand, Ethan said. Do you? Because yesterday was one thing, people standing up in the moment, but asking them to sacrifice actual money, maybe put themselves at risk long term, that's different. I know, which is why I'm leaving. Ethan, Mara started. It's the right call, he said. I've already stayed longer than I should have. No sense making things worse. He went upstairs, packed his few belongings, and came back down within 5 minutes. Mara stood by the door, arms crossed, looking like she wanted to argue but couldn't find the words. How much do I owe you? Ethan asked. You already paid. For the room, not for the trouble. The trouble was free, Mara said. Came with the territory. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out some bills. For Sarah, then, for whatever she needs. Mara looked at the money, more than a room should cost, more than was strictly necessary. She took it slowly, folded it, and tucked it into her apron pocket. You're a decent man, Mr. Cole. Debatable. Not from where I'm standing. They looked at each other for a moment, two people who'd shared something brief and real in a world that didn't offer much of either. Thank you, Ethan said. For yesterday, for the room, for treating a stranger like he mattered. You do matter, Mara said. Just because you're passing through doesn't change that. Ethan nodded, not trusting himself to respond, and headed out into the morning heat. George followed him toward the livery. You want company? I could walk with you. Make it look less like I'm sneaking out my own back door? Ethan smiled slightly. Appreciate it, but no. Better if I just go. They reached the corral where Ghost stood waiting. The horse lifted his head as Ethan approached, ears forward, already knowing what was coming. Ethan saddled him quickly, checked the cinch twice out of habit, and swung up into the leather. From the saddle, Hollow Ridge looked smaller, more fragile, the kind of place that could disappear from maps without anyone noticing except the people who lived there. Mr. Cole, George said, one more thing. Yeah? Those stories about Ashford Crossing, about what you did to Langford, are they true? Ethan thought about how to answer that. Truth was complicated. Truth depended on who was telling it and what they wanted it to mean. But George deserved something honest. True enough, Ethan said. I exposed some fraud, burned some contracts, made things difficult for a man who'd been making things difficult for everyone else. Whether that makes me a hero or just stubborn, I couldn't tell you. George smiled, slow, genuine, weathered. Maybe it makes you both. Maybe. Ethan touched his hat brim in farewell and turned Ghost toward the north road. They moved at a walk, unhurried, because running would only draw attention. Behind him, Hollow Ridge receded into the heat shimmer, becoming memory even as he watched. He didn't make it half a mile before he heard hoofbeats behind him. Ethan didn't speed up, didn't reach for the revolver he'd retrieved from his saddlebag and strapped on that morning. He just kept Ghost moving at a steady walk and waited for whoever it was to catch up. Two riders came alongside, Silas Ward and Brock Vance. No sign of the kid. Probably left him behind to watch the town, make sure this wasn't some kind of trick. Morning, Silas said pleasantly. Morning. Figured you'd leave early. Smart move. Seemed like the thing to do. They rode in silence for a while, 3 men on horseback heading north on a road that didn't really lead anywhere important. The sun climbed higher. The landscape stretched out flat and unforgiving in all directions. I did some checking last night, Silas said eventually. Sent some telegrams. Asked around about Ashford Crossing. Ethan said nothing. Interesting story, Silas continued. Victor Langford had quite the operation going. Land grabs, fraud, intimidation. And then you showed up and tore it all down in about 3 months. That's one version. You want to give me another? Not particularly. Brock shifted in his saddle, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation. He was a man of action, not words, and this felt too much like talking when they should be doing. Silas, on the other hand, seemed content to talk. Here's what I'm wondering, Cole. A man doesn't take on someone like Langford without backup, without resources, without some kind of authority. So either you had help I don't know about, or you're not just some drifter. Everyone's just some drifter if you go back far enough. That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting. Silas studied him for a moment, then nodded like he'd confirmed something. You know what the interesting part is? The really interesting part? I'm sure you're going to tell me. Langford's operation didn't just fall apart. It was dismantled, piece by piece, contract by contract, like someone knew exactly where to look and exactly what to burn. Silas leaned forward slightly in his saddle. That takes knowledge, Cole. Legal knowledge. The kind you don't pick up drifting from town to town. Ethan kept his eyes on the road ahead. Maybe I got lucky. Nobody's that lucky. They rode for another quarter mile. The tension built like storm clouds on a summer afternoon, heavy, present, waiting to break. Finally, Brock spoke up. Boss, we doing this or not? Doing what? Silas asked mildly. You know what? We're out here. He's alone. Why are we talking? Because I'm trying to understand something. What's to understand? $500 for a body? That's the job. Silas gave his partner a look that could have frozen water. The job is never just the job. That's why you do the heavy work and I do the thinking. Brock's jaw clenched, but he stayed quiet. Ethan watched the exchange with interest. Partnerships like this one always had fracture points. The trick was figuring out how deep the cracks went. Let me ask you something, Cole, Silas said. Langford put this bounty on you 6 months ago. Why haven't you collected it yourself? Come again? Man with your skills, your knowledge. You could have gone to the law, turned yourself in, fought it in court. Langford's in jail now. I confirm that much. His operation's finished. You could clear your name if you wanted to. Ethan was quiet for a moment. It was a good question, one he'd asked himself more than once in the dark hours before dawn. Maybe I don't want to clear it, he finally said. Why not? Because having a bounty on your head keeps you moving, keeps you from settling in, keeps you from getting comfortable. He glanced at Silas. And maybe that's better than the alternative. Which is? Stopping, staying, starting to care about things again. Ethan's voice was level, matter of fact. That's how you get hurt. That's how you lose things that matter. Silas absorbed that, nodding slowly. So you'd rather run than risk it. Wouldn't call it running, more like not staying still. Sounds like running to me. Then I guess that's what it is. They reached a fork in the road, one path continuing north, the other veering west toward the Badlands. Ethan started to guide Ghost toward the northern route, but Silas moved his bay to block the way. That's far enough, Silas said. Ethan stopped. His hand didn't move toward his gun, but the possibility hung in the air between them like smoke. This how it goes? Ethan asked. That depends on you. How do you figure? Silas reached into his jacket and pulled out a piece of paper, not the bounty notice, something else. He unfolded it carefully and held it up so Ethan could see. It was a telegram, dated 2 days ago. Came in late last night, Silas said, from the Territorial Marshal's office in Silver Creek. You want to know what it says? Ethan waited. Says Victor Langford's assets have been frozen pending investigation. Says anyone attempting to collect on bounties issued by Langford should be advised that payment is not guaranteed. Says there's some question about whether Langford had the legal authority to issue bounties in the first place. Silas folded the telegram slowly. Says the whole thing might be fraudulent. The words settled between them like dust after a wagon passes. Brock broke the silence. What? You heard me. So there's no money? There might be money. There might not be. Point is, we don't know. And I'm not in the habit of killing men for might be money. Brock looked like someone had just told him the sun wasn't real. This whole week, this whole ride, and you're telling me now? I'm telling you now because I just found out now, Silas snapped. And because unlike you, I actually read the telegrams that come in instead of just asking when we get paid. So what do we do? Silas looked at Ethan. That's what I'm trying to figure out. Ethan sat easy in his saddle, watching both men, calculating odds and outcomes. He could draw on them. Probably take Silas, maybe Brock, if he was quick enough. But killing them wouldn't solve anything, wouldn't stop other hunters from coming, wouldn't clear the bounty even if it was fraudulent. I got a suggestion, Ethan said. I'm listening. You two ride back to Silver Creek, check with the marshal directly. Find out if that bounty's legitimate. If it is, you can pick up my trail again later. If it's not, you save yourself a lot of trouble. And you? I keep riding north, like I was going to anyway. Silas considered this. What's to stop you from disappearing, changing direction once we're gone? Nothing, Ethan admitted. But I'm not going to. I don't run that way. Switching routes, covering tracks, hiding. I pick a direction and I stick with it. Ask anyone who's ever tracked me. I always go north. Why north? Because that's where the next town is. It was almost funny, the simplicity of it. Silas actually smiled, just slightly, the kind of smile that meant he recognized truth when he heard it. All right, Silas said. We'll check with the marshal. Brock made a disgusted sound. Just like that? We're letting him go? We're verifying information before we make a move that can't be taken back. That's called being professional. That's called being soft. Silas's hand moved fast, not to his gun, but to Brock's reins. He yanked the horse's head around, forcing Brock to grab the saddle horn to stay seated. Listen to me, Silas said, voice low and dangerous. I've kept you alive for 3 years because I think before I act. Because I don't kill men for money that doesn't exist. Because I know the difference between a bounty and a vendetta. He released the reins. If that makes me soft, you're welcome to ride out on your own any time. Brock straightened in his saddle, face red, hands shaking slightly. For a moment it looked like he might do something stupid. Then the moment passed and he just nodded once, tight and angry. Silas turned back to Ethan. You've got 48 hours. After that, if the bounty's legitimate, I'm coming for you. Fair enough? And Cole? One more thing. Yeah? That town back there, Hollow Ridge, they stood up for you. Don't make them regret it. Ethan met his eyes. I don't plan to. Silas nodded, pulled his horse around, and started back south. Brock followed after a moment, casting one last hostile glance at Ethan before urging his horse into a trot. Ethan watched them go, waiting until they were distant specks before he continued north. Ghost moved beneath him with the smooth gait of a horse that had walked 1,000 miles and would walk 1,000 more without complaint. The sun climbed toward noon, the heat pressed down like a physical weight. Ethan thought about Hollow Ridge, about Mara Ellison and her sharp eyes and sharper spine, about a town that had remembered what it meant to stand together. He thought about Silas Ward, too, a man who'd had him dead to rights and chosen to wait instead. That spoke to character. Spoke to the difference between a hunter and a killer. And he thought about that telegram, about Victor Langford's frozen assets, and the possibility that this whole mess might evaporate like morning dew. Might. That was the word that mattered. Might meant uncertainty. Might meant waiting. Might meant 48 hours of riding and looking over his shoulder and wondering if this was the day everything caught up to him. Ghost's ears flicked back, listening. I know, Ethan said quietly. I'm thinking too much again. The horse snorted. Agreement or commentary, hard to say. They rode through the afternoon without incident, covering ground steadily but without urgency. The landscape didn't change much. Scrub brush, rocky soil, the occasional mesa rising in the distance. This was territory that belonged to no one and everyone. The kind of space that existed between settlements where the law was more suggestion than reality. Toward evening, Ethan spotted smoke rising from a small valley off the main road. Could have been anything. Campfire, brush fire, settlers. But something made him turn Ghost toward it, some instinct he'd learned to trust, even when it didn't make obvious sense. What he found was a wagon with a broken axle and 3 people standing around it looking frustrated and hot. A man, a woman, and a girl maybe 12 years old. The man was on his back under the wagon, trying to assess the damage, while the woman fanned herself with her bonnet, and the girl sat in the shade of the wagon bed looking miserable. Ethan rode up slow, hands visible, making sure they could see he wasn't a threat. The man rolled out from under the wagon, squinting up at Ethan. He was maybe 40, weathered, with the look of someone who'd been farming or ranching their whole life. Help you? Saw your smoke, thought you might need a hand. The man glanced at his wife, some silent communication passing between them. Then he looked back at Ethan. Axle's cracked. Not broken clean, but close enough. We need to get to Harrison's Bend by tomorrow, or we'll miss the land office appointment. Harrison's Bend is 50 miles north, Ethan said. I know where it is. Just making sure. The woman stepped forward. She was thin, tired, but had the kind of determination you saw in people who'd decided they were going to survive no matter what. Can you fix it? Maybe. Mind if I take a look? The man waved him forward. Ethan dismounted and crawled under the wagon. The axle was oak, thick and solid, but it had taken too much weight over rough terrain and developed a split about 8 inches long. Not fatal yet, but it would be if they kept rolling with a full load. He slid back out. You've got maybe 5 more miles before it breaks completely, less if you hit rough ground. Can you repair it? The woman asked again. Not permanently, but I can bind it with rawhide and hope it holds. You'll need to lighten the load, though. Whatever you can leave behind, leave it. The family exchanged looks, calculations being made, priorities being weighed. We can't leave anything, the man said. Everything in that wagon is what we need to start over. Tools, supplies, seed. Then you won't make it to Harrison's Bend. There's got to be another way. Ethan stood up, brushing dust off his pants. There's always another way. Question is whether you'll like it. What do you suggest? I reinforce the axle best I can. You take it slow, walking speed slow, and I ride ahead to Harrison's Bend, find a wheelwright, and bring him back to meet you halfway. You might miss your appointment, but at least you'll get there with your supplies intact. The man rubbed his face, thinking, that would put you out. I'm heading that direction anyway. Still, we can't pay you, not until we get settled. Didn't ask for payment. The woman looked at Ethan with the kind of suspicion born from too many broken promises. Why would you help us? It was a fair question. One Ethan wasn't entirely sure how to answer. A week ago, he would have ridden past without stopping, would have figured they'd sort it out themselves, or they wouldn't. That's how you survived when you kept moving, by not getting involved in other people's problems. But something had shifted. Maybe it was Hollow Ridge. Maybe it was Mara Ellison standing between him and 3 guns. Maybe it was just exhaustion from running. Because I can, Ethan said finally, and because you need it. He spent the next hour working on the axle, using rawhide strips from his saddlebag to bind the split wood. It wasn't elegant, and it wouldn't last long, but it would buy them time. While he worked, the girl, her name was Emma, sat nearby asking questions. Are you a cowboy? Not exactly. What are you then? Just traveling? Where are you going? North? That's not a place. Sure it is. It's wherever you end up when you keep going that direction. Emma thought about this, legs swinging from where she sat on a rock. My papa says we're going to have a farm, a real one, with chickens and maybe a cow. That sounds nice. Do you have a farm? No. Do you have a house? No. Where do you live? Ethan paused in his work, considering how to explain it to a 12-year-old. Mostly on Ghost. That's my horse. That's a funny name for a horse. He's a funny horse sometimes. She giggled at that, which made Ethan smile despite himself. When he finished with the axle, the man, his name was Daniel Pritchard, tested it carefully. The repair held. They loaded back into the wagon, moving with exaggerated caution, and Ethan gave them detailed instructions on which routes to take and how to signal if the repair failed. Harrison's Bend, Ethan said. Stay on the main road. I'll find a wheelwright and send him south. Shouldn't take more than a day. Thank you, Mrs. Pritchard said. Truly. Safe travels. He swung back into the saddle and watched them pull away slowly, the wagon creaking but holding together. Emma waved from the back, and Ethan waved back before turning Ghost north again. The sun was setting now, painting everything in shades of gold and red. Ethan made camp near a small creek, letting Ghost drink his fill while he built a fire and heated beans in a tin cup. The food was bland but filling. The night was quiet except for crickets and the occasional coyote in the distance. He thought about the Pritchards and their broken wagon and their hope for a fresh start. Thought about how many families he'd seen trying to do the same thing, moving west, chasing land, chasing opportunity, chasing something better than what they'd left behind. Most of them didn't make it. The land was too hard, the weather too unpredictable, the distance too great. But some did. Some actually built something that lasted. Ethan wondered what that felt like. He rolled out his bedding near the fire, used his saddle as a pillow, and stared up at the stars. They were bright out here, away from any town lights. Countless points of light that didn't care about bounties or broken wagons or men trying to figure out where they belonged. Tomorrow he'd reach Harrison's Bend, find a wheelwright, maybe send a telegram to Silver Creek, see if there was any news about that bounty. Keep moving, because that's what he did. But tonight, lying under stars that had watched 1,000 generations come and go, Ethan Cole allowed himself to wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was something worth stopping for. He fell asleep not knowing that in 2 days, everything would change. That the telegraph office in Harrison's Bend held news that would force him to stop running whether he wanted to or not. That Hollow Ridge, the town he'd left behind, was about to become the most important place he'd never planned to return to. Harrison's Bend was bigger than Hollow Ridge, but not by much. Maybe 200 people if you counted the outlying ranches. It had a proper main street with actual businesses that seemed to be operating. A bank, a hotel, 2 saloons, a general store with fresh paint, and a telegraph office that looked like it had been built sometime in the last decade instead of the last century. Ethan rode in just after noon, ghosts' hooves kicking up dust that hung in the still air. The town had that midday quiet where people retreated indoors to escape the heat. A few horses stood tied at hitching posts, tails swishing at flies. A dog sprawled in the shade of the hotel porch, too hot to even lift its head as Ethan passed. He found the wheelwright's shop on a side street near the livery. The door stood open, and inside he could hear the rhythmic sound of someone working wood. Ethan dismounted, tied Ghost to the post, and stepped into the relative cool of the workshop. The wheelwright was a compact man in his 50s, sleeves rolled up, sweat darkening his shirt. He looked up from the wheel he was truing, squinted at Ethan, and went back to his work. "Help you? Got a family about 20 miles south with a cracked axle," Ethan said. "They need someone who can meet them on the road. Fix it proper so they can make it the rest of the way here." The wheelwright kept working, checking the wheel's alignment with practiced eyes. "When?" "Today if possible. Tomorrow at latest." "Today's not possible. I've got 3 jobs ahead of them. They've got a land office appointment. Miss it and they lose their claim." The wheelwright paused, considered this, then shrugged. "Not my problem. First come, first served. That's how I run things." Ethan pulled out some bills and laid them on the workbench. "How about now?" The man looked at the money, then at Ethan. "That theirs or yours?" "Mine." "Why?" "Because they need help and I said I'd get it." The wheelwright wiped his hands on a rag, picked up the money, and counted it slowly. It was more than the job would normally cost. Ethan knew that and didn't care. Sometimes money was the only thing that moved people, and he'd learned not to resent it. Just use it when necessary. "All right," the wheelwright said. "I'll head out in an hour. South Road, you said?" "Main route. They're moving slow. Can't miss them." "Fair enough." Ethan left the shop feeling like he'd accomplished something, however small. It was a strange feeling, satisfaction without benefit. He'd helped the Pritchards and gotten nothing from it except the knowledge that they'd probably make it to their appointment. That should have felt pointless. Instead, it felt almost good. He led Ghost to the livery, arranged for feed and water, and then walked to the telegraph office. The operator was a thin woman with spectacles and ink-stained fingers. She looked up as Ethan entered, all business. "Need to send or receive?" "Both. I'm expecting a telegram from Silver Creek. Name's Cole." She shuffled through a stack of papers, pulled one out, and handed it over. "Came in this morning." Ethan took it, unfolded it carefully. The message was short, typed in the clipped style of telegraph communication. "Langford arrested. Assets frozen. All bounties issued by Langford office declared void pending investigation. Federal warrants supersede private contracts. Advise any interested parties bounty no longer valid. Territorial Marshal Office, Silver Creek." He read it twice, letting the words sink in. The bounty was void. Not just uncertain, void. $500 that had hung over his head for 6 months had evaporated like smoke. "Good news?" the operator asked. Ethan folded the telegram and put it in his pocket. "Could be worse?" "Need to send a reply." "No, but I need to send 2 others." He wrote out messages, one to Silas Ward at the last known location, one to Mara Ellison in Hollow Ridge. Keep them brief, factual, no unnecessary details. Ward needed to know the hunt was over. Mara needed to know she and her town were safe from any blowback. The operator counted his coins, typed up the messages, and sent them clicking out over the wire. "Anything else?" When's the next stage to Ashford Crossing? She consulted a schedule tacked to the wall. 3 days. Leaves Thursday morning, arrives Saturday evening. Ethan nodded, filed that information away, and left the office. The sun seemed brighter somehow, the air clearer. He'd been running for 6 months from something that no longer existed. The relief should have been immediate and total. Instead, he felt oddly unmoored, like a sail that had been pulling against the wind suddenly going slack. He walked to the nearest saloon, a place called the Frontier, with a hand-painted sign that had seen better days, and pushed through the doors. The interior was dark after the bright street, cool and quiet. A few men sat at tables playing cards. The bartender polished glasses with mechanical precision. Ethan took a stool at the bar. Whiskey, whatever's cheap. The bartender poured without comment and slid the glass across. Ethan sipped it slowly, letting the burn ground him. The whiskey was indeed cheap, rough and unrefined, the kind that cleared your sinuses and made your eyes water. He drank it anyway. "You look like a man with thoughts," the bartender said. "That obvious?" "I've seen a lot of faces in this job. Can usually tell the difference between someone drinking to forget and someone drinking to think." "Which am I?" "Think. Though I could be wrong." Ethan smiled slightly. "You're not wrong." He ordered another whiskey and sat there for an hour, watching the afternoon slip toward evening. Men came and went. Conversations rose and fell. Life continued in the ordinary way it does in places where nothing dramatic ever happens. Eventually, a man sat down 2 stools away, older, gray-haired, wearing a marshal's badge that had been polished recently. He ordered coffee, not whiskey, and when it came, he wrapped both hands around the cup like he was warming them despite the heat. "You're Cole," the marshal said. "Not a question." "I am." "Thought so." "Telegraph operator mentioned someone asking about the Langford bounty. Figured you'd end up here." Ethan turned to look at him properly. The marshal had the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades outdoors, and the calm eyes of someone who'd seen enough violence to not be impressed by it anymore. "You here to tell me to move on?" Ethan asked. "Should I be?" "Depends on what you know about me. Know you dismantled Langford's operation. Know you had a bounty on your head that's now void. Know you helped a family on the road yesterday. Wheelwright told me when I asked why he was leaving town on short notice." The marshal sipped his coffee. "Know you're trying to figure out what comes next now that you don't have to keep running." Ethan didn't bother denying any of it. "You always this informed about strangers passing through?" "When they're interesting, yes. When they're trouble, definitely. You seem to be both." "I'm not looking for trouble." "Never met anyone who was," the marshal said. "Trouble just shows up whether you're looking or not." They sat in silence for a moment. The marshal drank his coffee. Ethan finished his second whiskey and decided that was enough. "Name's Warren," the marshal said. "Been wearing this badge for 23 years. Seen a lot of men come through this territory. Some good, some bad, most somewhere in between." "Which am I?" "Haven't decided yet. But I'll tell you what I think. I think you're someone who got tired of watching people get hurt and decided to do something about it. I think that decision cost you more than you expected. And I think you're standing at a crossroads right now trying to figure out which direction to go." Ethan looked at him. "You always this direct? Life's too short for dancing around things." Warren set down his empty cup. "Here's my advice, Cole. Take it or don't. You spend your whole life running. You never build anything worth keeping. You spend your whole life fighting. You forget what peace looks like. Find something in between. Find a place that needs what you have to offer and stay long enough to matter." "That's supposed to be profound?" "That's supposed to be practical," Warren said, from one tired man to another. He stood up, dropped some coins on the bar for his coffee, and headed for the door. At the threshold, he paused and looked back. "One more thing. Town called Hollow Ridge, about 40 miles south. Telegraph came through today from a woman named Ellison. Said to tell you thank you if you came through here. Said the town remembers what you did." Ethan's chest tightened slightly. "That all she said?" "Said one other thing. Said you're welcome back anytime." Warren touched the brim of his hat. "Think about it, Cole. A place that stands up for you when you're vulnerable is worth considering." Then he was gone, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts and an empty whiskey glass. The bartender came over to refill it, but Ethan waved him off. "I'm done." What do I owe you? 2 whiskeys, call it 4 bits. Ethan paid and walked out into the late afternoon sun. The street was starting to come alive again as the heat broke. People emerging from wherever they'd hidden during the worst of it. He walked aimlessly for a while, thinking about what Warren had said, about crossroads and directions and places worth keeping. Ghost was in good hands at the livery. The Pritchards would get their axle fixed. The bounty was void. Everything that had been pressing on him for months had lifted. So why did he feel more lost than before? He ended up at the hotel, rented a room for the night, and climbed the stairs to a second-floor space that smelled like old wood and laundry soap. The room was small: bed, chair, wash basin, window overlooking the street. He sat on the bed and pulled out the telegram again, reading it one more time. Bounty no longer valid. 4 words that changed everything and nothing. He was free to go anywhere, do anything. Free to stop looking over his shoulder. Free to settle down if he wanted. Except he'd forgotten how to want things like that. 6 months of running had worn grooves into his thinking. Wake up, move, survive, sleep, repeat. Adding stay to that pattern felt impossible, like teaching yourself to breathe differently. He lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. Somewhere below, he could hear the sounds of the hotel coming alive for the evening. Doors opening and closing, voices in the hallway, the clatter of dishes from the dining room. Normal sounds of normal life. Ethan closed his eyes and saw Hollow Ridge, saw Mara Ellison standing between him and 3 guns, saw the town forming that human wall, scared, but there anyway. Saw Ghost waiting patiently in the shade while his rider slept unaware of danger closing in. He saw the Pritchards and their broken wagon, saw Emma asking questions about cowboys and farms, saw Daniel trying to fix something he didn't have the tools to fix, but trying anyway, because what else could you do? He saw Silas Ward reading that telegram and making the choice to wait instead of kill. Saw the difference between a hunter and a murderer in the space of a single decision. And he saw himself, 39 years old, worn down, used up, still moving because he didn't know how to stop. Still running because standing still meant facing everything he'd lost or never had. The ceiling didn't offer any answers. Neither did the growing darkness outside his window. But somewhere in that darkness, 40 miles south, was a town that had stood for him, a place that remembered. Warren's words echoed in his mind. Find something in between. Find a place that needs what you have to offer. What did he have to offer? He could track criminals, expose fraud, dismantle corrupt operations. He knew the law better than most lawyers and could read people better than most sheriffs. He could ride all day, live rough, survive on nothing. But could he stay in one place? Could he build something instead of tearing things down? Could he be part of a community instead of just passing through it? He didn't know, and the not knowing kept him awake long after he should have been asleep. Somewhere around midnight, he got up, splashed water on his face, and looked out the window. Harrison's Bend was quiet now, just a few lights still burning. Peaceful. Ordinary. The kind of place where nothing important ever happened, and people liked it that way. He'd been to 100 towns like this. They all blurred together after a while, different names, same dusty streets, same tired faces. But Hollow Ridge hadn't blurred. Hollow Ridge had been different, and he couldn't quite figure out why. Sleep eventually found him in the small hours before dawn. He dreamed of crossroads and choices, and a gray horse that always knew which direction to go even when his rider didn't. Morning came with harsh light and immediate regret about the whiskey. Ethan's head pounded as he got dressed, but the pain was familiar enough to ignore. He packed his few belongings, settled his bill, and headed to the telegraph office before leaving town. The operator looked up as he entered. Back already? Any replies come in? She checked her stack. 1. From Silver Creek. Addressed to Cole. He took it, already knowing what it would say. Silas Ward confirming receipt of the information, acknowledging the bounty was void, no hard feelings. Professional courtesy between men who'd almost killed each other. But when he unfolded the telegram, it said something different. Bounty confirmed void. Will not pursue. But Cole needs to know Jet Corbin did not accept this outcome. Left partnership yesterday. Heading back to Hollow Ridge, says 500 or not he has score to settle. Could not stop him. Thought you should know. Ward. Ethan read it twice, feeling his stomach drop. Jet. The young one. Green, reckless, too much pride and not enough sense. The kind of kid who'd see a voided bounty as a personal insult rather than reality. The kind who'd go after what he wanted regardless of consequences. Need to reply? The operator asked. Yeah, to Hollow Ridge, Mara Ellison. He spoke slowly while she readied her key. Jet Corbin coming your way. Young bounty hunter. Dangerous and stupid. Get people inside. Stay away from him. I'm coming back. She sent it, collected his payment, and looked at him with new interest. That urgent? Very. Ethan left the office at a run. The livery was just opening when he got there, the stable hand barely awake and not moving fast enough for Ethan's liking. My horse! Now! Hold on, I gotta... Now! Something in Ethan's voice penetrated the morning fog. The hand hustled, bringing Ghost out already saddled from yesterday. Ethan checked the cinch, swung up, and pointed the horse south. You didn't pay for... The hand started. Ethan tossed coins without looking back and kicked Ghost into a gallop. 40 miles. At a hard run, maybe 4 hours if Ghost held up. But you couldn't run a horse flat out for 4 hours without killing it. He'd have to pace it, gallop, canter, walk, repeat. Maybe 5 hours, maybe 6. Too long, way too long if Jet got to Hollow Ridge first. The sun climbed as Ethan rode, turning the landscape into a furnace. Ghost's coat darkened with sweat. Ethan's shirt stuck to his back. They pushed south with single-minded focus, eating up distance but never enough. Never fast enough. He thought about Jet Corbin as he rode, remembered the kid's face, young, angry, eager to prove something, 22 maybe, with more confidence than skill. The kind who'd been told he was tough his whole life and believed it. The kind who couldn't handle being told no. The kind who'd see a town defending a stranger as a challenge to his authority, his manhood, his worth. Dangerous because he was reckless. Stupid because he couldn't see past his own ego. And heading toward a town that had no idea how to deal with someone like that. Ethan pushed Ghost harder than he should have. The horse gave everything he had, but biology had limits. By midday, they had to slow down or risk permanent damage. Ethan dismounted, led Ghost at a walk, let him breathe and recover. Every minute felt like an hour. Come on, Ethan muttered. Come on! Ghost's ears flicked back, listening. They were 20 miles out when Ethan saw the dust cloud ahead. A rider coming north fast. For a wild moment, he thought it might be Jet, that maybe the kid had somehow gotten past Hollow Ridge and was running. But as the rider got closer, Ethan recognized the horse. A roan, the same one Jet had been riding. But the rider wasn't Jet. It was George Hendricks from Hollow Ridge, the old man with the gray beard. He pulled up hard when he saw Ethan, the roan blowing and sweating. Cole, George gasped. Thank everything. We got your telegram. Sent me to find you. What happened? Kid showed up about 2 hours ago. Rode straight into town asking for you. When we said you weren't there, he started making threats. Said he'd wait. Said anyone who got in his way would regret it. Anyone hurt? Not yet. But Mara tried talking to him, and he shoved her. Hard. She went down. George's jaw tightened. Some of us moved to help her, and he drew his gun, said the next person who moved would get shot. Ethan felt something cold settle in his chest. Where is he now? Saloon, drinking, waiting. Said you'd come back because you're the hero type. Said he's going to kill you in front of everyone so they understand what happens when you disrespect him. How many people are still out there? Most folks went inside when he started waving his gun around. But Mara won't leave. Says it's her town and she's not hiding from some child with a pistol. Of course she wouldn't. Of course. Go back, Ethan said. Tell Mara I'm coming. Tell her to get inside and stay inside. She won't listen. Tell her anyway. George nodded and turned his roan back south. The horse was spent, but George urged it to a trot anyway. Ethan remounted Ghost and followed, pushing harder now, consequences be damned. The landscape blurred. The sun beat down. Ghost ran because Ethan asked him to, because that's what the horse did, gave everything when it mattered most. They crested the last rise and Hollow Ridge appeared below. From a distance, it looked quiet, peaceful, like nothing was wrong. But Ethan knew better. He rode into town at a canter, slowing Ghost only when they reached the main street. The town was eerily empty, doors and windows closed despite the heat, no one on the boardwalks. No children playing, just silence and the feeling of people holding their breath. And there, Sitting in a chair outside the saloon, with a bottle in one hand and his gun belt prominently displayed, was Jet Corbin. The kid looked up as Ethan approached. His face split into a grin that was part triumph, part relief, and mostly just young and stupid. "There he is," Jet called out. "The man himself. Took you long enough." Ethan dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible. "Jet, this doesn't have to happen." "Sure it does. You made me look like a fool." "I didn't make you anything. The bounty got voided. That's not on me." "You're right, it's not." Jet stood up, swaying slightly. He'd been drinking for a while. "It's on you for making Silas back down, for making him choose verifying information over just taking what we came for. You humiliated us. Silas is smart. He made the right call." "Silas is soft," Jet spat. "Just like you said, and I'm done following soft men." Ethan noticed movement in his peripheral vision. Mara, standing in the doorway of her boarding house, one hand pressed to her side where she'd been shoved. She looked furious and scared in equal measure. "Mara," Ethan said quietly, "go inside." "No." "Please." "I said no." Jet laughed. "See? Nobody listens to you, Cole. You're not special. You're just lucky, and luck runs out." "This is between you and me," Ethan said, turning his full attention back to the kid. "Let everyone else go about their business." "Why would I do that? They need to see this. Need to understand what happens when you get in the way of men doing their job." "The job's over, Jet. There's no bounty, no contract, no reason." "I don't need a reason." Jet's hand hovered near his gun. "I just need you to draw." Ethan kept his hands loose at his sides. He'd worn his gun today, had strapped it on when he left Harrison's Bend, but he didn't want to use it. Killing a drunk kid in the middle of the street wasn't justice. It was just waste. "Walk away," Ethan said. "Get on your horse, ride out, and don't come back. No one has to die today." "Someone does," Jet said. "Either you or me, and I'm betting on you." People were watching now. Ethan could feel them behind windows and doors, peeking through cracks, witnessing this stupidity unfold. The whole town holding its breath again, waiting to see if their street would be stained with blood. "You're drunk," Ethan said. "Your hand's shaking. Even if you draw first, you'll miss." "Want to test that?" "No, I really don't." But Jet wasn't listening anymore. His eyes had that glassy, determined look of someone who'd made up their mind and couldn't be reached with words or reason. He was going to draw it. It was just a question of when. Ethan thought fast. The kid was maybe 15 feet away. Too close for comfort, too far to rush without getting shot. His gun was holstered, same as Jet's, both right-handed, both facing each other in the classic setup that had killed hundreds of men over stupid disagreements and wounded pride. The street waited. The town waited. Even the air seemed to wait, hot and still and heavy with expectation. "Last chance," Ethan said. "Walk away." Jet's hand dropped to his gun. Time did that thing it does in moments like this, stretched and compressed simultaneously. Ethan saw Jet's fingers close around the grip, saw the kid's arms start to move, saw the barrel beginning to clear leather, and Ethan drew. He'd been fast once. Not the fastest, but fast enough. Age had slowed him some, but muscle memory ran deeper than age. His hand found the grip, cleared the holster, brought the barrel up in one smooth motion that felt automatic as breathing. The gun came level just as Jet's cleared his belt. Ethan fired. The shot cracked across the street, startlingly loud in the silence. Jet jerked back, stumbled, and fell. His gun clattered to the boardwalk unfired. For a moment, no one moved. Then Mara was running toward them, and George was coming out of wherever he'd been hiding, and suddenly there were people everywhere, converging on the scene with the morbid curiosity that follows violence. Ethan holstered his gun and walked to where Jet had fallen. The kid was alive. Ethan could see his chest moving, but he'd been hit in the shoulder. Blood spread across his shirt, dark and wet. His face had gone pale, eyes wide with shock and pain. "You shot me," Jet whispered. "Yeah. I could have killed you." "You couldn't have," Ethan said, not unkindly. "Your hand was shaking. You were drunk. You telegraphed your draw. I could have shot you 5 different ways." "Then why?" "Because I aimed for your shoulder instead of your chest. Because killing you wouldn't fix anything." Ethan crouched down next to him. You're young and stupid, Jet. But young and stupid doesn't deserve to die. Mara arrived with cloths and water, immediately going to work on the wound. She was rough about it, deliberately so, Ethan thought, pressing the cloth harder than strictly necessary. Jet hissed in pain. Should let you bleed, Mara muttered. Coming into my town, threatening my people, shoving me like I'm nothing. I'm sorry, Jet gasped. You wanted to prove something, Ethan finished. I understand. Been there. But you went about it wrong. George stood nearby, shaking his head. Someone needs to ride for a doctor. I'll go, one of the other men offered, already heading for the livery. Ethan stood up, looking around at the gathered crowd. They looked at him differently now, not quite hero worship, but something adjacent. Respect mixed with caution, the realization that the quiet drifter was more dangerous than he appeared. He hated that look, had seen it too many times in too many towns. It was the look that turned you into a story instead of a person, a legend instead of a man. Show's over, he said flatly. Someone help Mara get him inside. Rest of you go back to whatever you were doing. The crowd dispersed slowly, reluctantly. George and another man helped Jet to his feet. The kid could barely stand between the blood loss and the shock and the alcohol working its way out of his system. They half carried him toward Mara's boarding house. Mara paused at the door, looking back at Ethan. You came back? Yeah. Didn't have to. Yeah, I did. She studied him for a moment, then nodded and went inside. The door closed behind her, leaving Ethan alone in the street with Ghost and the fading echo of gunfire. He stood there for a while, letting the adrenaline drain away, feeling the familiar emptiness that always followed violence. He'd shot men before. More than he wanted to count. Each time left the same bitter taste. The knowledge that someone's choices, or your choices, or just bad luck, had led to blood and pain and consequences that couldn't be undone. At least Jet would live. That was something. He walked Ghost to the water trough, let him drink his fill. The horse was exhausted from the run, lathered and breathing hard. Ethan stripped off the saddle, rubbed him down with handfuls of grass, talked to him quietly while the horse recovered. We can't keep doing this, Ethan said softly. Running, fighting, moving on. There's got to be something else, something better. Ghost snorted and shook his mane, spraying water. Yeah, I know, but where? The horse didn't answer. Horses never did. But Ghost looked at him with those intelligent eyes, patient and steady, and Ethan felt something shift inside his chest. A loosening. A possibility. He thought about what Marshal Warren had said. Find a place that needs what you have to offer and stay long enough to matter. He thought about Hollow Ridge standing between him and guns, about Mara refusing to move, about a town remembering what it meant to stand together. He thought about the telegram. You're welcome back any time. And he thought about how tired he was of leaving. The doctor arrived an hour later, a gruff man in his 60s who took one look at Jet's shoulder and started barking orders. Ethan stayed out of the way, sitting on Mara's porch while the work happened inside. Evening came slowly, the heat finally breaking, the sky turning orange and purple. Mara brought him coffee and sat down in the chair next to him. They didn't talk for a while, just watched the sky change colors. He'll be fine, Mara finally said. Doctor says the bullet went clean through. Missed anything important? He'll have a scar and a story, but he'll live. Good. You could have killed him. Didn't want to. Most men would have. Ethan sipped his coffee. I'm tired of killing. Been tired of it for a long time. Mara was quiet for a moment. What are you going to do now? It was the question he'd been avoiding all day. The question that had been chasing him for 6 months. The question he finally had an answer to. I don't know, he said honestly. Bounty's void. No one's chasing me. I could go anywhere. But I keep thinking about what you said, about this town being yours, about standing up because that's what people do when they're not alone. We stood up for you. I know, and that means something. He looked at her. Question is what? Mara smiled, small, knowing, patient. That's a question you have to answer yourself, Mr. Cole. They sat there until full dark, drinking coffee and watching Hollow Ridge settle into evening. Somewhere someone played that fiddle again, still not very well. A dog barked. life continuing in its ordinary way. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Ethan Cole didn't feel the pull to leave, didn't feel the need to be somewhere else, someone else, something else. He just felt tired, and maybe, possibly, ready to rest. 3 days passed before Jet was well enough to travel. 3 days during which Ethan found himself still in Hollow Ridge, still sleeping in Mara's boarding house, still not quite ready to saddle Ghost and point him north. He told himself he was waiting to make sure the kid didn't develop an infection, that someone needed to keep an eye on things in case any of Jet's associates came looking for him, that Ghost needed proper rest after being run so hard. All of it was true. None of it was the real reason. The real reason was harder to name. It sat in his chest like something half-formed. Not quite hope, but not quite resignation either. Something in between that he couldn't identify because he'd spent so long avoiding feelings that didn't serve a practical purpose. On the second day, he helped Thomas Brennan finish the awning repair. The work was simple, holding boards while Thomas hammered, measuring twice before cutting once, the kind of physical labor that occupied hands without requiring much thought. They worked in comfortable silence, two men who understood that sometimes the best conversations happened without words. When they finished, Thomas stood back to admire the work. "Looks good. Looks like it might last a few more years." "Will if you maintain it," Ethan said. "That's the trick, isn't it? Maintenance. Easier to let things fall apart than to keep them standing." Thomas wiped sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief. "But I'm tired of watching this town crumble. Figure it's time to start building instead." "Why now?" Thomas looked at him. "Because you showed us it matters. What happened the other day, folks standing together, choosing to be brave when it would have been easier not to, that reminded people what we used to be, what we could be again." "I didn't do anything." "You did enough. Sometimes that's all it takes. Someone doing enough to remind everyone else they can too." He clapped Ethan on the shoulder. "Beer's on me if you want it. Saloon opens in an hour." "I'll think about it." Ethan walked the main street afterward, really looking at Hollow Ridge for the first time. It was dying. That much was still true. Half the businesses were closed, paint peeled from buildings that had once been proud. The railroad tracks at the edge of town were rusted from disuse, weeds growing between the ties. But there were signs of life too. The awning Thomas had fixed, a woman sweeping her porch with actual care instead of just going through motions. Two men discussing plans to reopen the feed store, their voices carrying optimism that sounded fragile but real. A garden behind one of the houses showing fresh tilling, someone trying to grow something in soil that hadn't been worked in years. Small things, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. Ethan had spent 6 months not paying attention to anything except the road ahead and the threats behind. Looking at Hollow Ridge now felt like learning to see again after walking in darkness. He ended up at the saloon as the sun started its descent. The place was busier than he'd seen it, maybe a dozen men scattered at tables, a few playing cards, others just drinking and talking. The bartender nodded at him as he entered. "Cole, what'll it be?" "Just water." The bartender raised an eyebrow, but poured it without comment. Ethan took the glass to a table in the corner where he could watch the room. Old habit, always know your exits, always keep your back covered, always be aware of who's moving and why. George Hendricks came in a few minutes later, spotted Ethan, and walked over. "Mind if I sit?" "Free country." George lowered himself into the chair with the careful movements of someone whose joints protested more than they used to. "How's the kid doing?" "Doctor says he'll be fine. Sore and stupid, but fine." "Those two usually go together." George signaled the bartender for a beer. "You planning to press charges?" "For what? Being young and dumb? That's not a crime." "He threatened people, drew on you, could have killed someone." "Could have, but didn't. And he's already paid for it with a hole in his shoulder and a lesson he won't forget." Ethan drank his water. "Besides, I don't want to spend months dealing with territorial law. I just want him gone." "Fair enough." George's beer arrived and he took a long pull. "So, you staying or going?" "Haven't decided." "That's a lie." Ethan looked at him. "Excuse me?" "I said that's a lie. You've decided. You're just scared of what you decided." George leaned back in his chair. "I've been alive 67 years, Cole. Raised 4 kids, buried a wife, survived 2 droughts and more bad winters than I can count. And I've learned to recognize when a man's fighting himself. That's what you're doing. Fighting the part of you that wants to stay against the part that thinks you should keep moving. You always this direct with people you barely know? Life's too short to dance around things. You want me to shut up? Say so. Otherwise, I'm going to keep talking. Ethan almost smiled. Keep talking. You're tired. Anyone can see it. Tired of running, tired of fighting, tired of waking up alone in strange places, wondering why you're doing any of it. And 3 days ago, this town stood up for you when it didn't have to, and something in you recognized that as rare, as worth considering. You practiced this speech? Didn't need to, I'm just saying what's obvious. George finished his beer and wiped his mouth. Here's what I think. I think you've spent so long protecting other people that you forgot someone might want to protect you too. I think yesterday scared you because it meant Hollow Ridge cared enough to send me riding out to find you. That we weren't just defending a stranger, we were defending someone we'd decided mattered. Ethan stared at his water glass. I shot a man in your street. You shot a man who was threatening to kill you. That's different. Is it? Yeah, it is. George stood up slowly. Look, Cole, I'm not going to tell you what to do, but I will tell you this. We could use someone like you here. Someone who knows the law, knows how to handle trouble, knows what justice looks like when it's not just the loudest voice or the biggest fist. This town's trying to remember how to be something. Could use help doing it. He walked away before Ethan could respond, leaving him alone with his thoughts and his water. The saloon got busier as evening settled in. Men came off work shifts, looking for a drink before heading home. Conversations rose and fell. Someone started a card game that quickly drew spectators. Normal life in a place trying to be normal again. Ethan sat there watching it all, thinking about what George had said. About being tired. About people wanting to protect him. About staying versus going and the fear that came with both. He thought about the last 6 months. Sleeping rough, eating worse, always looking over his shoulder, never quite relaxed. About towns that were just names on a map, places to pass through without leaving marks or memories. About conversations that never went deeper than how much for a room and which way's north. He thought about Ashford Crossing and what he'd done there. Dismantling Langford's operation had felt righteous at the time, necessary, like balancing scales that had been tipped wrong for too long. But afterward, when the dust settled and the consequences came, he'd left. Packed up, rode out, didn't stick around to see if what he'd broken could be rebuilt into something better. Because that's what he did. Fix things by breaking them, then move on before the hard work of actual rebuilding started. Hollow Ridge was different. Hollow Ridge wanted to rebuild. And maybe, just maybe, it wanted his help. The question was whether he could give it, whether he remembered how to be part of something instead of just passing through it. Sarah came into the saloon carrying a basket covered with a cloth. She spotted Ethan and walked over, setting the basket on his table. From Mama, she said. Said you probably haven't eaten and someone needs to make sure you do. Ethan pulled back the cloth, bread, cheese, some dried meat. Simple food, but thoughtfully prepared. Thank her for me. Tell her yourself. You're coming to supper tomorrow, by the way. Mama insisted. She did she? She said, and I quote, that man needs a proper meal and some company before he convinces himself he's better off alone. So yes, 6 o'clock. Don't be late. Sarah turned to leave, then paused. Mr. Cole? Yeah? I'm glad you came back. When George rode out to find you, I was scared you wouldn't come, that you'd just keep going. She looked at him with eyes too old for 19. But you came back. That means something. She left before he could respond. Ethan sat there with the basket of food, feeling something tighten in his chest that might have been gratitude or might have been fear or might have been both. He ate slowly, making the simple food last. When he finished, he went to check on Ghost in the livery. The horse was doing well, rested, fed, groomed by someone who cared. He stood in the stall with his head over the door, watching Ethan approach with calm recognition. Hey, Ethan said quietly, running a hand down Ghost's neck. How you feeling? The horse butted his shoulder gently. Yeah, I know. You're fine. You're always fine. Ethan leaned against the stall door. I'm thinking about staying, just for a while, just to see what it's like. Ghost's ears swiveled forward, listening. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking I'm crazy, that we don't stay places, that staying means getting attached, and getting attached means getting hurt. He was quiet for a moment. But maybe that's not the worst thing. Maybe getting hurt means you cared about something. Maybe that's better than not caring at all. The horse didn't answer, but his presence was steady and reassuring. Ghost had been with Ethan for 8 years, longer than any person, any place, any job. Through everything, the horse had been constant, patient, loyal in the way animals are loyal, without judgment or expectation. "If I stay," Ethan said, "you'd have a real stall, regular feed, maybe even some mares to look at." He smiled slightly. "Could be worse, right?" Ghost snorted and turned away, more interested in the hay and his feeder than Ethan's existential crisis. "Fair enough," Ethan said. He walked back to the boarding house as night fell. The sky was clear, stars beginning to appear in that hard, bright way they did in territories without much light to compete with. Somewhere a woman was singing, voice drifting out of a house window, nothing fancy but true. A baby cried briefly, then stopped. Dogs barked at each other across the darkness. The sounds of people living, of community existing despite hardship, of life insisting on itself even when circumstances suggested otherwise. Ethan sat on the porch, watching those stars, listening to those sounds, feeling the weight of decision settling on his shoulders. He could leave tomorrow. Pack up, ride north like he'd planned, find another town and another temporary bed, and another reason to keep moving. Or he could stay, at least for a while, at least long enough to see if George was right, if this place actually needed what he had to offer, long enough to figure out if he remembered how to be part of something. The door opened behind him. Mara came out carrying 2 cups of coffee and handed him one without asking if he wanted it. "Can't sleep?" she asked, settling into the other chair. "Not yet." "Too much thinking?" "Probably." They drank in comfortable silence. The coffee was strong and hot, cutting through the cool evening air. A breeze picked up, carrying the smell of dust and sage. "Jet's leaving tomorrow," Mara said. "Doctor cleared him to travel if he takes it slow. I'm giving him some supplies and pointing him east. Told him if I ever see him in Hollow Ridge again, I'll finish what you started. You think he'll listen?" "I think he's scared enough and humbled enough that yes, he will." She glanced at Ethan. "You were right not to kill him. Boy's stupid, but he's young. Might grow out of it." "Maybe. What about you? You growing out of anything?" Ethan looked at her. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Means you've been here 3 days pretending you're waiting for the kid to heal. But really, you're trying to decide if you have permission to stay." Mara's voice was gentle but firm. "So I'm telling you now, you do. You have permission. This town already decided you're welcome. The only person who hasn't decided is you." "It's not that simple." "It never is. But it's also not that complicated." She set down her cup. "You want to know what I think? Do I have a choice?" "Not really. I think you're looking for a reason. Something big and important that makes staying feel justified. But life doesn't work that way. Sometimes you stay because the coffee's good and the bed's comfortable and people look at you like you matter. Sometimes that's enough." Ethan absorbed that, turning it over. "And if it's not enough? If I try staying and realize I can't do it, then you leave. Nobody's going to chain you here. Nobody's going to make you feel bad about it." She stood up, collecting both cups. "But at least you'll know. At least you'll have tried instead of spending the rest of your life wondering what if." She went inside, leaving him alone with the night and his thoughts. What if? 2 words that carried more weight than they should. What if he stayed and it worked? What if he stayed and it didn't? What if he left and regretted it? What if he left and felt relieved? The stars didn't care about his dilemma. They'd been burning for millions of years and would burn for millions more, indifferent to human worry and doubt. There was something comforting in that, the universe's complete lack of interest in his problems. Eventually, he went inside and upstairs to his room. Sleep came easier than he expected, and he dreamed of nothing important. Morning brought Jet's departure. The kid came downstairs pale but steady, one arm in a sling, moving carefully to avoid jarring his shoulder. He looked younger in daylight, more boy than man, the bravado stripped away by pain and consequence. Mara handed him a wrapped package. "Food for the road. There's salve in there, too, for the wound. Change the dressing twice a day. Keep it clean." "Thank you, ma'am." Jet's voice was quiet, almost ashamed. "Don't thank me. Just don't come back." He nodded and turned to Ethan, who stood near the door. "Cole, I owe you. You don't owe me anything, Ethan interrupted, except maybe to think before you act next time, to understand that pride's not worth dying over. I know that now. Good. Remember it when your shoulder stops hurting and you start feeling tough again. Jet almost smiled. Yes, sir. He walked out slowly, climbed onto his horse with obvious difficulty, and rode east without looking back. They watched him go until he disappeared into the morning haze. Think he learned anything? Mara asked. Maybe. Won't know for years. People either learn from getting shot or they don't. Philosophical. Realistic. She went back inside to start breakfast preparations. Ethan stood on the porch a moment longer, watching the empty street. Thomas was already at work on something. Looked like he was repairing the boardwalk now, replacing rotten boards with new ones. The sound of hammering echoed in the still morning air. Ethan found himself walking over, watching the work. Thomas looked up, wiped sweat, and gestured at the pile of boards. Want to help? Don't you have paying customers? Store's not open yet. Got time. Thomas held out a hammer. Unless you've got somewhere else to be. Ethan took the hammer. They worked in silence for an hour, replacing boards, measuring cuts, building something solid where there'd been rot. The work was satisfying in a way Ethan hadn't felt in years. Creating instead of destroying, building instead of breaking down. By the time the sun climbed high, they'd replaced a good 20 feet of boardwalk. Thomas stood back, examining their work with approval. Looks solid. Might last another decade if we're lucky. Might last longer if you maintain it. There's that word again? Maintain. Thomas glanced at him. You any good at maintaining things, Cole? Never really tried. Maybe you should. Might find you're better at it than you think. He collected his tools. Supper at my place tomorrow if you're interested. Wife makes the best pot roast in the territory. 6:30. I'm having supper at Mara's tonight. Then come to mine tomorrow. One doesn't prevent the other. Thomas smiled. Unless you're planning to leave before then. I'm not, Ethan heard himself say. Planning to leave, I mean. Not yet. Good. 6:30. Don't be late. He walked away, leaving Ethan standing on the new boardwalk, slightly surprised by his own words. Not yet. That meant staying, at least for now. The day continued in small moments and quiet conversations. He helped move some heavy crates at the general store. Talked with George about water rights and property disputes. Turned out there were some lingering issues from years back that nobody knew quite how to solve. Watched Sarah teach two younger children their letters in the shade of a cottonwood tree. Her patience endless and genuine. And everywhere he went, people nodded, said hello. Treated him not like a stranger or a legend, but like someone who belonged there. That evening, he presented himself at Mara's dining room at exactly 6 o'clock. She'd set the table for 3, her, Sarah, and him. The meal was simple but abundant. Roasted chicken, vegetables from someone's garden, fresh bread that was still warm. They ate together, conversation flowing easily around topics that didn't matter much but filled the space comfortably. Sarah talked about her students. Mara mentioned plans to expand her garden. Ethan found himself contributing more than he expected. Observations about the town, ideas for fixing long-neglected problems, thoughts on what could work if people actually tried. After dinner, Sarah excused herself to visit a friend. Mara and Ethan sat on the porch with coffee, watching the sun set in brilliant oranges and purples. You know what you're doing, don't you? Mara said. What's that? Putting down roots, maybe without meaning to, but doing it anyway. She looked at him. Helping Thomas with the boardwalk. Talking with George about property disputes. Eating dinner with us like it's normal. Those are the things people do when they're part of a community. I helped fix a boardwalk. That's not exactly putting down roots. It's a start, Mara said. And starts matter. They're how everything begins. Ethan didn't argue. Couldn't, really, because she was right. He was doing exactly what she described, inserting himself into the fabric of Hollow Ridge bit by bit, act by act, conversation by conversation. The question was whether he'd keep doing it or pull back before the roots went too deep. What happened to your husband? He asked suddenly. Mara was quiet for a moment. Train accident? 10 years ago. He was working the line when a coupling failed. Killed him and 2 others. She stared at her coffee. Hollow Ridge was thriving back then. Railroad brought commerce, people, life. After the accident, the company paid some compensation and moved their operations north. Town's been dying ever since. You could have left. Where would I go? Everything I know is here. Sarah was 9 years old, needed stability, and this was our home. Still is, even if it's falling apart. She looked at him. You understand that, don't you? How a place can be home even when it's broken. Ethan thought about Ashford Crossing, about the families he'd helped, the fraud he'd exposed, the justice he'd brought, about how he'd left before seeing if any of it mattered in the long run. Yeah, he said quietly. I understand. They sat until full dark, not talking much, just being. When Ethan finally said goodnight and went upstairs, he felt something that might have been contentment, or might have been exhaustion, or might have been the first stirring of belonging. He lay in bed thinking about roots and starts and the difference between passing through and staying. Thinking about a town that remembered what it meant to stand together. Thinking about whether he could remember what it meant to stand with them instead of just for them. Sleep came eventually, and with it dreams of boardwalks and gardens and horses that didn't have to keep moving north because there was nowhere else to go. Morning would bring more small moments, more quiet decisions, more incremental steps towards something that looked suspiciously like a life. But that was tomorrow's concern. Tonight, for the first time in months, Ethan Cole slept without checking the window for threats or planning his exit route. Tonight, he just slept, in a room that was starting to feel familiar, in a town that was starting to feel possible, with the growing sense that maybe, just maybe, running wasn't the only option anymore. 2 weeks became 3. 3 became a month. And somewhere in that time, without Ethan quite noticing when it happened, Hollow Ridge stopped being a place he was staying and started being a place he lived. The shift was gradual, made of small things that accumulated like dust on a windowsill. He moved from the boarding house to a small room above the closed feed store. Thomas offered it for almost nothing, said the building needed someone in it to keep the rats away. Ethan cleaned it out, patched the roof where it leaked, built a proper bed frame from scrap lumber. It wasn't much, but it was his. Ghost got a permanent stall at the livery, with an arrangement that Ethan would help with repairs in exchange for reduced board. He spent mornings mucking stalls and fixing fence posts, work that was honest and straightforward in ways that tracking criminals had never been. George approached him one afternoon with a stack of papers, land deeds, water rights agreements, contracts that nobody understood anymore because the people who'd written them were long dead. You said you know law, George said. Think you could make sense of this mess? Ethan spent 3 days reading through documents, untangling disputes that had festered for years. A rancher who thought he owned water rights he'd never actually purchased. 2 families fighting over a property line that had never been properly surveyed. A lease agreement that had expired a decade ago but nobody had noticed. He wrote up summaries, explanations, recommendations, met with the involved parties, explained what the documents actually said versus what people thought they said. Some folks got angry. Nobody likes being told they're wrong, especially about things they've believed for years. But most accepted his findings because they trusted him, because he'd stood with them when guns were drawn, because he was one of them now. That realization hit him one morning while he was shooing Ghost in the livery. One of them, part of the community. Not a stranger, not a drifter, just Ethan Cole, who lived above the feed store and knew about legal documents and could fix a boardwalk. It should have scared him, should have triggered that old instinct to pack up and move before the attachments got too strong. But instead it felt like finally setting down something heavy he'd been carrying too long. Sarah started bringing her students by twice a week for what she called practical education. Ethan would talk about contracts, property rights, how to read legal documents without a lawyer, basic things that most people never learned but needed. The kids, ranging from 8 to 16, listened with varying degrees of attention, but they listened. One afternoon after the older students had left, Sarah stayed behind. She was organizing papers, movements precise and deliberate. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Go ahead." "Why'd you do it? Ashford Crossing, I mean. Why'd you take on Langford when it wasn't your fight?" Ethan leaned against the desk, considering the question. It was one he'd asked himself often enough. "It was my fight because I was there and nobody else was doing anything. Sometimes that's all it takes, being in the right place at the right time with the wrong amount of tolerance for injustice." "That's not a real answer. It's the only one I've got." He paused. "You want the truth?" "I don't know why I did it. Maybe because my father lost his farm to someone like Langford when I was a kid. Maybe because I was tired of watching powerful people hurt weak people and getting away with it. Maybe because I was just angry and needed somewhere to point it. Sarah looked at him with those two old eyes. And now? Are you still angry? Some days, but it's different now. Before, the anger was all I had. Now it's just one thing among others. What are the others? Ethan smiled slightly, still figuring that out. She left satisfied with that non-answer, and Ethan realized he just had the kind of conversation you have with people you know, people who matter, the kind of conversation that required honesty instead of deflection. That evening, he had supper at Thomas Brennan's house. The pot roast was indeed exceptional. Thomas's wife, Clara, was a quiet woman with sharp intelligence and the ability to make observations that cut straight to truth without being cruel about it. "You settling in all right?" she asked, passing him more bread. "Seems like it." "Good. Town needs people who know how to stand up straight. Too many years of everyone hunching over, trying to make themselves small so life wouldn't notice them, and hit again." She looked at him directly. "You taught folks they could stand tall. That's worth more than fixing boardwalks or sorting out property disputes." "I didn't teach anyone anything. They already knew. They just needed a reason to remember." "Maybe," Clara said, "but you gave them that reason. Don't downplay it." Thomas raised his glass. Just water, but the gesture mattered. "To standing tall." Ethan raised his own glass, feeling awkward but also touched. "To Hollow Ridge." "To second chances," Clara added softly. They drank, and the evening continued with easier topics. Weather predictions, gossip about neighbors, plans for the fall harvest. Normal things. Family things. The kind of evening Ethan hadn't experienced since he was a child, before his father lost everything and the family scattered like seeds in wind. Walking back to his room afterward, he passed Mara's boarding house. She was on the porch as usual, and he stopped to say hello. "You look different," she observed. "How so?" "Less like a man planning his escape route. More like a man who knows where he sleeps tonight and isn't worried about tomorrow." She smiled. "It's a good look on you." "You always this observant?" "Comes with running a boarding house. You learn to read people or you end up with trouble you didn't see coming." She rocked slowly in her chair. "You know what I think?" "I'm sure you'll tell me." "I think you spent so long believing you didn't deserve a home that you forgot how to recognize one when it was offered. And now you're standing in the middle of it, surprised to find yourself happy." Ethan started to deny it, then stopped. Because she was right. He was happy. Not in some grand, overwhelming way, just in the quiet satisfaction of days that had purpose, work that mattered, people who knew his name and were glad he was there. "Yeah," he said finally. "I guess I am." "Good. You've earned it." He continued to his room feeling lighter than he had in years. The space was small and simple. Bed, table, chair, stove, window overlooking the street. His few possessions arranged neatly. Ghost saddle resting on a stand he'd built. A life that fit in one room and somehow felt more substantial than years of wandering had ever been. He lay in bed that night thinking about roots and how they grew. Not all at once, not dramatically, just slowly, incrementally, reaching into soil until one day you realized you were anchored. Connected, part of something larger than yourself. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. A wagon rolled into town carrying the Pritchard family, Daniel, his wife Elizabeth, and Emma. They looked better than when Ethan had last seen them, less desperate, more settled. Emma spotted him first and waved enthusiastically. "Mr. Cole! Mr. Cole!" Ethan walked over as Daniel set the brake. "Pritchards, didn't expect to see you again." "We made it," Daniel said, climbing down. "Got our land, filed our claim, thanks to you getting us that wheelwright." He reached into the wagon and pulled out a wrapped package. "Brought you something. First vegetables from our garden. Not much, but we wanted you to have them." Ethan took the package. Carrots, tomatoes, some greens. Simple food grown with effort and care. "You didn't have to do this." "Yes, we did," Elizabeth said firmly. "You helped us when you didn't have to. Let us return the favor." Emma was already petting Ghost, who'd stuck his head out of his stall to investigate the visitors. "He's so pretty. Can I ride him sometime?" "Emma, don't bother Mr. Cole," Daniel started, but Ethan waved him off. "She's not bothering me. And yeah, if your parents say it's okay, we can take him for a walk later." Emma's face lit up with pure joy. The kind of uncomplicated happiness that kids have before life teaches them to guard their feelings. Really? Really? They spent an hour together, Ethan showing Emma how to properly approach a horse, how to read Ghost's body language, how to lead him without pulling or being afraid. Daniel and Elizabeth watched with the careful attention of parents, making sure their daughter was safe, but also letting her experience something new. When they finally loaded back up to head home, Daniel shook Ethan's hand. "You ever need anything, Cole? Anything at all? You come find us. I appreciate that. I mean it. You gave us our chance. We won't forget." They rolled away, Emma waving from the back until they disappeared from sight. Ethan stood there holding his package of vegetables, feeling that strange tightness in his chest again. People remembering, people caring, people connecting their present to their past and including him in both. George found him a few minutes later. "Got a situation that needs your input." "What kind of situation?" "The kind where two stubborn men are about to come to blows over something stupid, and someone with sense needs to step in before it gets ugly." They walked to the saloon where two ranchers, brothers named Walsh, were squared off across a table, faces red, voices raised. The argument was about water access, a spring that fed both their properties, but that one brother was allegedly diverting more than his share. Ethan listened to both sides, asked questions, examined the property maps George had brought. The solution was simple once you looked at the actual documents. They'd both been wrong about the boundary line, which meant both had legitimate access, but neither was diverting unfairly. Just a misunderstanding compounded by stubbornness and pride. "Here's what you're going to do," Ethan said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who knew he was right. "You're going to survey that boundary properly. Then you're going to split the cost of building a proper channel that feeds both properties equally, and you're going to shake hands and stop acting like children." The brothers glared at each other, neither wanting to back down. Finally, the older one, Patrick, stuck out his hand. "Fine, but he pays for the surveyor." "We split it," Ethan said flatly. 50-50. "That's the deal." Patrick grumbled but nodded. His brother Sean shook his hand, and just like that, the crisis was over. They left together, still irritated but no longer on the verge of violence. George clapped Ethan on the shoulder. "You're getting good at this." "At what?" "Being the voice of reason, the person folks trust to be fair." He smiled. "You know what that's called?" "What?" "Leadership." Ethan shook his head. "I'm not a leader. I'm just someone who can read property documents." "You're someone people listen to, someone they respect. That's leadership, whether you call it that or not." George headed for the door, then paused. "Town meeting next week. We're discussing whether to try attracting new businesses, maybe even getting the railroad interested again. You should be there." "Why?" "Because your opinion matters. Because if you think it's possible, other people will believe it too." He left before Ethan could argue. Ethan sat there for a moment, absorbing what had just happened. He'd settled a dispute. People had listened to him, trusted him to be fair, and now they wanted his input on the town's future. That was the moment he understood he wasn't just staying in Hollow Ridge. He was becoming part of what Hollow Ridge might become. The town meeting happened in the evening, held in the saloon because it was the only space big enough for everyone. 40-some people crowded in, most of the adult population plus a few teenagers like Sarah who insisted on being included. Thomas acted as moderator, keeping discussions on track when they threatened to spiral into old grievances or impossible dreams. The core question was simple. Was Hollow Ridge worth saving? And if so, how? Opinions varied. Some folks thought they should just accept the town was dying and make peace with it. Others wanted to try everything, right to the railroad, offer incentives for new businesses, market themselves as a good place to settle. A few suggested just giving up and moving elsewhere. Ethan listened for a long time before speaking. When he finally did, the room went quiet. "I'm not from here," he started. "Been in Hollow Ridge maybe 6 weeks, so take what I say with that in mind. But here's what I've seen. I've seen a town that remembered how to stand together when it mattered. I've seen people choosing to fix things instead of letting them fall apart. I've seen community that most places have forgotten how to build." He paused, making sure he had everyone's attention. "You want to know if Hollow Ridge is worth saving? It already saved itself. What happened when those bounty hunters came for me, that wasn't about me. That was about you deciding what kind of place this would be. And you chose courage over convenience. That's rare. That's valuable. That's the foundation everything else builds on. But how does that bring the railroad back? Someone called out. It doesn't. Railroad's gone and probably staying gone. But you don't need the railroad. You need what you already have: land, water, people willing to work. You need to stop thinking about returning to what you were and start thinking about what you could become. Like what? Clara Brennan asked. Like a place people want to come to because it's different, because it's real, because it's a community that actually functions like one. Ethan warmed to the topic. You market that. You tell families looking for land that Hollow Ridge has good water, cheap property, and neighbors who'll help you succeed instead of competing with you. You tell businesses that you've got space, workforce, and a town that supports local enterprise. You build on what you have instead of mourning what you lost. The room was quiet, people absorbing this. Then Mara spoke up. He's right. We've been so focused on grieving what died that we forgot we're still alive. And being alive means we can grow, maybe not into what we were, but into something else, something better. That's easy to say, Patrick Walsh muttered. Hard to do. Everything worth doing is hard, George said. Question is whether we're willing to try. The debate continued for another hour, but something had shifted. People were talking about possibilities instead of just problems. Planning instead of just lamenting. By the time the meeting ended, they'd formed committees, one to draft letters to potential settlers, another to inventory available properties, a third to develop plans for infrastructure improvements. Ethan found himself on all three committees without quite knowing how it happened. Walking back with Mara afterward, she linked her arm through his in a gesture that was friendly and familiar, and made him realize how much he'd changed. You did good tonight, she said. I just said what made sense. You gave them hope. That's more valuable than sense. She looked up at him. You know what you've become, don't you? What's that? Part of Hollow Ridge's future, not just its present. People are building their plans around the assumption you'll be here. That should scare me. Does it? Ethan thought about it honestly. No, not anymore. They reached her boarding house and she squeezed his arm before letting go. Good, because we need you. Not the mythical Cole who took down Langford, just you, Ethan. The man who fixes boardwalks and sorts property disputes and tells stubborn ranchers to act like adults. That's not exactly heroic. No, Mara agreed. It's better. It's real. And real lasts longer than heroic. She went inside, leaving him on the porch with those words echoing in his mind. Real lasts longer than heroic. He'd spent so much of his life chasing justice, fighting corruption, being the man who rode in and fixed things. But that was performance, not life. That was being a character in someone else's story instead of living his own. Here, in Hollow Ridge, he wasn't performing. He was just existing, helping because he could, staying because he wanted to, building something instead of just breaking things down. That night he dreamed of the crossroads Marshall Warren had mentioned, but this time he wasn't standing there trying to choose a direction. He was walking away from it, heading towards something that looked like home. The weeks that followed were full of work. Letters got written and sent. Properties got surveyed and listed. Small improvements happened. The boardwalk extended, some buildings repainted, the water system repaired. New families started inquiring, attracted by cheap land and the promise of community. One afternoon, a young couple rode in, newly married, looking for a place to start their life together. Ethan showed them around, explained what Hollow Ridge offered, was honest about the challenges. They signed papers that evening, bought 20 acres outside town, and started making plans. You're good at this, the young husband said. Selling people on a place. I'm not selling anything, Ethan replied. Just showing what's here. If it's what you want, great. If not, that's fine too. But they wanted it, and they weren't alone. Over the next month, 3 more families arrived. The population grew. The feed store reopened. Thomas convinced a merchant from 2 towns over to take a chance. Business came back slowly, tentatively, but it came. Hollow Ridge wasn't thriving, not yet, but it was alive. It was trying, and that mattered. One evening, 6 months after he'd first ridden into town planning to sleep on a bench and leave by morning, Ethan sat on his porch. Because it was his porch now, the room above the feed store having become home in ways he'd stopped questioning, and watched the sunset paint the sky. Ghost stood in his stall, content and well-fed. The street below showed signs of life, people talking, children playing, the sounds of community persisting. Hollow Ridge wasn't saved yet, but it was no longer dying. It was finding its way toward something new. Mara came walking up the street and climbed the stairs to join him. She didn't ask permission, just sat down in the chair he kept there for visitors. "Been thinking," she said. "About?" "About that first day, when those men came for you and I stepped between you and their guns." She was quiet for a moment. "Want to know what I was thinking?" "What?" "I was thinking that I was tired of being afraid, tired of hiding, tired of watching bad things happen and telling myself it wasn't my problem. And I looked at you sleeping there, vulnerable and unaware, and something in me just said, no, not this time, not in my town." "I'm glad you did. So am I. Because it changed things, changed me, changed all of us." She looked at him. "You were the catalyst, Ethan. But we did the work. We chose to be different. And that choice is what saved Hollow Ridge, not you riding in like some hero." "I never thought I was a hero." "I know. That's part of why it worked." She smiled. "Heroes leave. Regular people stay. And staying is harder. Braver, maybe. Because staying means dealing with the boring parts, the hard parts, the parts where nothing dramatic happens, and you just have to show up day after day." Ethan nodded slowly. "I'm starting to understand that." "Good, because we're counting on you to keep showing up." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell. Somewhere someone was playing that fiddle again. Better now, like they'd been practicing. A dog barked. A baby cried. Life continuing in all its messy, ordinary glory. Eventually, Mara stood to leave. At the top of the stairs, she turned back. "Ethan?" "Yeah?" "Thank you for coming back that day, for staying, for becoming part of this. Thank you for standing between me and those guns, for giving me a reason to stay." She nodded and disappeared down the stairs. Ethan sat there a while longer, thinking about the strange path that had led him here. About running and stopping. About breaking things down and building them up. About the difference between passing through and putting down roots. He thought about Langford and Ashford Crossing, about the bounty that had chased him and the fear that had driven him. About Silas Ward making the choice to wait instead of kill. About Jet Corbin learning the hard way that pride wasn't worth dying over. He thought about the Pritchards and their broken wagon. About Marshall Warren's advice. About a gray horse who'd carried him thousands of miles and finally found a place to rest. But mostly, he thought about Hollow Ridge. About a dying town that had remembered how to stand up. About people who'd chosen courage when it would have been easier to look away. About community that actually meant something instead of just being a word people used. And he thought about himself. 39 years old, worn down, but not broken. Finally understanding that home wasn't a place you found. It was a choice you made every day. A commitment to showing up, to caring, to being present even when it was hard. Especially when it was hard. The stars came out, brilliant and indifferent. Somewhere north, other towns existed where he'd never been. Other roads stretched toward other horizons. The world was large and full of places to see and things to do. But Ethan Cole had spent enough time seeing places and doing things. He'd spent enough years running from attachments and consequences and the risk of caring too much. He'd earned the right to stop, to stay, to be part of something that mattered because he chose to make it matter. Tomorrow would bring more work, disputes to settle, plans to make, a community to help build. There would be setbacks and frustrations, failures and disappointments. Nothing would be smooth or easy or perfect, but it would be real. And real, as Mara said, lasted longer than heroic. Ethan went inside, undressed, and climbed into bed. Through the window he could see Ghost in his stall, head lowered, resting. Both of them had traveled far to arrive here. Both of them had found what they were looking for without quite knowing they were looking for it. As sleep claimed him, Ethan's last conscious thought was simple and true. He was home. Not because Hollow Ridge was perfect, but because it was his. Because these people were his people. These problems were his problems. This future was his future. And for a man who'd spent most of his life running, standing still felt like the bravest thing he'd ever done. The night settled over Hollow Ridge, peaceful and ordinary. And in a small room above a reopened feed store, A man who'd learned to stop finally slept without dreaming of roads or running or anywhere else but here.